People don't really understand it until you actually see it coming at you.
We are at a unique point in human history. Due to the scientific genius of men and women, we can either, on the one hand, improve the standard and quality of life of all mankind, or we can destroy the planet as we know it.
The time has come to say fair's fair, to pay the rent, to pay our share. The time has come, a fact's a fact, it belongs to them, let's give it back. How can we dance when our earth is turning?
We have never lost so much property.
How do we sleep while our beds are burning? How can we dance when our earth is turning? How do we sleep?
The Aboriginal community have had a long history of fire management.
When Aboriginal people first saw wildfire, they were stunned.
You've got to do the right thing by country, and you've got to support that country, and otherwise you don't have identity, and you don't have a healthy landscape. You can't survive.
We burn grass when it's properly dry, but what we're going to do when the whole world fires?
There's everything to be gained, nothing to be lost. And Aboriginal people had a history of achievement. Let's learn from them.
From Kintor East to Yudamu, the Western Desert lives and breathes in 45 degrees.
The time has come to say fair's fair, to pay the rent, to pay our share. The time has come, a fact's a fact.
We've got each other.
It belongs to them, let's give it back. How can we dance when our earth is turning? How do we sleep while our beds are burning? How can we dance when our earth is turning?
What we're going to do when the whole world fires?
How do we sleep while our beds are burning? How can we dance when our earth is turning? How do we sleep while our beds are burning?
This is about the younger people coming on behind you. Are they going to have a habitable world? We've got to do our very best to ensure that they do.
How do we sleep while our beds are burning?
Good evening. I'm Susan Hay, President of Environment Haliburton, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the concerned citizens of Haliburton County and Environment Haliburton to this webinar, which we have called No Planet B. This event has been partly inspired by a dedicated group of volunteers called Fridays for Future, who have created this global day of climate action, which will become a weekly event all over the world. This Fridays for Future group was inspired by Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teen who decided that climate change was important enough for her to protest by herself on the steps of the Swedish parliament, even in the midst of winter. But it was her ability to express herself and her extensive knowledge of climate change that impressed political leaders and climate scientists to give her the credibility to start a global youth movement. I'm sure you all know about her. She's amazing and we admire her dedication and her perseverance. Talk about how one small person can change the world. Our purpose this evening is to learn more about how climate change is going to affect cottage country in Ontario. We have already had the pleasure of having Peter Sale, a biologist and author, speak at an Enviro Cafe a year or so ago, and we have become acquainted with a group of people in Muskoka called Climate Action Muskoka, who have been doing some great work in Huntsville, Bracebridge, and Gravenhurst. In a moment, we're going to have Environment Haliburton member Terry Moore talk briefly about how our evening will unfold. But first, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is traditional territory that has been used for generations by First Nations for fishing, hunting, and gathering, and we honor their care of it. Before I hand the controls over to Terry, we're going to show a 3-minute video of Greta talking about why we think we need to talk about climate change as an emergency.
We need to see it as, above all, an existential crisis. And as long as it's not being treated as a crisis, we can have as many of these climate change negotiations and talks, conferences as possible. It won't change a thing. We have to admit that this is not a crisis that we can build ourselves out of, or invest, or buy, or consume, or produce, because that is the same approach that got us into this crisis. As we explain in this letter, that we have already locked in a certain amount of warming. If you just look at the planned production of fossil fuels that the world's countries are planning to produce by the year 2030, according to the UN Production Gap Report, that accounts for 120% more than what would be consistent with the 1.5 degree target. So that means that if we are to stay below these targets, we have to make it possible to tear up and abandon valid contracts and deals, and that is not possible within today's system. The corona pandemic is a crisis and it needs to be treated as a crisis. And the climate crisis is also a crisis that needs to be treated as a crisis. But I don't think we should compare these two crises. We should be very careful with that. The coronavirus has, of course, no positive effects on the climate whatsoever, despite what people may say. This is a tragedy and nothing else. Both of these crises are symptoms of lack of respect for each other and for the natural world, for fellow human beings, basically. But I think that we are now, with the Black Lives Matter protests, that really shows that people are starting to wake up to these injustices and that we cannot no longer continue to sweep these things under the carpet and ignore it. It could be equality, it could be justice, racial justice, gender equality, also see that with the Me Too, but also sustainability and thereby the climate crisis. So I think that people are starting to wake up to these things more and more. Hope comes from action. If you don't want to feel terrified or worried or scared, then the only thing you can do is to take action.
So despite those technical difficulties, I think it's really energizing to hear Greta Thunberg talk so clearly about the seriousness of the climate emergency, and for her to call for leaders everywhere to tell it like it is and to act accordingly. Of course, one of the challenges we face is how to press for real effective action for climate remediation and to pull back from the brink at the scale of the actual problem that we're confronting. It's true, whether or not this action is required at the international, the national, the provincial, or the local level. In recent times, there's been a noticeable uptick in local climate change planning activism in Canada as students and local citizens and non-governmental organizations press local municipal councils to declare climate change emergencies and adopt greenhouse gas reduction targets that represent a fair share of Canada's obligation to keep global warming below 2 degrees C, preferably 1.5 degrees C. Now, we know that the planet's already experienced global average warming of about 1.1 degrees Celsius due to past emissions, and that the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere has barely twitched during the COVID-19 economic lockdown and stood at 412 parts per million as of September the 12th. Some 1,400 climate emergency declarations around the world have been issued, and 500 of those have been issued in Canada. Tonight, what we thought we would do is focus on some of the possibilities and limitations of local climate change planning activism. We thought we'd start by reviewing what the science and the research tells us about what changes in the climate we can expect in this neck of the woods through to mid-century, rather than focusing only on the global trends. And to help us do that, we've asked Peter Sale, one of the principal movers behind the Muskoka Watershed Council's 2016 report, Planning for Climate Change in Muskoka, to summarize the science for us. Following Peter's presentation, we'll hear from Sue McKenzie, one of the key organizers with Climate Action Muskoka. Sue will tell us about how Climate Action Muskoka has turned a proposal for District Council to pass a climate change emergency declaration resolution, and how they've turned that into an opportunity to organize a kind of broadly based on-the-ground campaign to build community-wide support for aggressive climate action. Finally, I'll spend a few minutes reviewing what's been happening on the local climate change planning front in Haliburton County and the status of greenhouse gas emission reduction targets adopted recently by the county and the townships. After each of the presentations we have been concluded, we'll have lots of time for questions and comments from participants. I would ask that you use the chat function on your screen to put forward your comments and questions as they arise. I'll try to monitor those comments and questions and then put them in an organized fashion to Peter and then Sue, and then I'll answer, I guess, for myself at the end of the third presentation. We anticipate that each of those presentations will be about, at the max, 15, 20 minutes or so. And once we've dealt with any questions directed at a specific panelist, we want to encourage discussion about the possibilities and limitations of local municipal government-driven climate change planning processes generally, and specifically the idea of organizing around an endorsement for a climate emergency declaration in Haliburton County. So with that introduction, I'd like to focus on Peter for a second, the first presenter tonight. Peter is a marine ecologist who's seen firsthand the degradation of coral reefs during his working life. He was educated at the University of Toronto, where he completed a master's thesis on a near extinct species of trout, and at the University of Hawaii, where he began his lifelong engagement with coral reef fishes. He's been a faculty member at the University of Sydney in Australia, University of New Hampshire in the United States, and University of Windsor in Canada. He served as the assistant director for the Institute for Water, Environment and Health at the United Nations University based in Hamilton, Ontario. His work is focused primarily on reef fish ecology and on the management of coral reefs, which he studied in Hawaii, Australia, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. In Peter's 2011 book, that's ominously titled Our Dying Planet, Peter tells the story of the global environmental crisis. He believes that this is a complex and very serious problem that can be solved, though, and has to be solved, must be solved soon if we're going to have a good future for our children and our grandchildren. Despite the title of his book, he strongly believes that our planet does not have to die. Peter is the past chair and a current executive member of the Muskoka Watershed Council and one of the main drivers behind the 2016 report, Planning for Climate Change in Muskoka. He lives in Muskoka with his wife, Donna, and he has one son and a granddaughter born, I take it, in 2010. So, Peter, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Terry. It's good to be here, and hopefully what I'm going to say is going to be interesting. I'm going to start immediately sharing my screen, and so that should come up with a title. There we go. And so whenever I talk about climate change these days, I begin by welcoming people to the Anthropocene, because most people don't realize we're in the Anthropocene. We were in the Holocene period for the entirety of the development of human civilization, from the beginning of agriculture. The last 11,500 years have been the Holocene, and it's a very stable time on the planet. And people have got used to being able to depend on the planet. And you know that you're going to reap the rewards at a certain time, and so on and so forth. And suddenly we're in the Anthropocene. It is a different time on this planet. The planet is suddenly changing very rapidly compared to any changes in the past. And those changes have been caused by us. And that's what makes the Anthropocene really unique, because it's the first time the planet has been bounced around by a single species of life. And so welcome to the Anthropocene. We could have a wonderful Anthropocene, or we could have a frightening Anthropocene, depending on how we behave as we move into the future. Now, how much is climate changing in central Ontario? Well, the lakes in Muskoka are open 3 weeks longer than they were in the 1970s. This blue line here shows the date at which ice formed on a lake, beginning in 1975 and going up to about 2009. And you see it's getting later and later in the year. And the pink line at the bottom shows the date at which the ice came off the lake, and it's getting very slightly earlier in the year. And the difference between those two gives us the 3 extra weeks. Now, that's a big deal, because lakes are basically asleep when they're covered with ice. And so we've got 3 extra weeks added to the part of the year when the lake is active. And that's because of climate change. And it's been going on for quite a while. We're already seeing more serious flooding, more severe flooding events. The 2019 event was quite bad in Muskoka. This is the Bracebridge Falls in 2019. This is downtown Huntsville in 2019, and most of that water is supposed to be dry land. So clearly we have some problems, and we have problems because there's more water moving around than there used to be, because the climate is changing. Muskoka's heading towards an average warming of between 4 and 6 degrees by 2100 if we don't bring climate change under control. Sea level isn't going to affect Muskoka, but the things we have already done to the atmosphere have caused glaciers around the world to begin to melt, and sea level is rising. Sea level hardly rose at all during the bulk of the Holocene. Sea level is now rising rapidly, and it's going to rise for at least 1,000 years, even if we stopped putting CO2 into the atmosphere tomorrow, which we clearly won't do. I actually saw something in Nature this afternoon. It came out yesterday. It's a brand new article in Nature by a group of people from the Potsdam Institute, looking at the behavior of the Antarctic ice sheet. And one of the things that absolutely fascinates me at the moment is we're learning more and more about climate change. And every time we learn something, it seems to get a little bit different. And what this article is talking about is how the ice sheet in the Antarctic is unstable. And there are certain temperature thresholds it will reach where it will do dramatic things. And what they summarize in their article is this sentence, which I think is quite alarming. The ice sheet's temperature sensitivity, meaning how much ice will melt and how much will sea level rise for a degree rise in temperature. That's its temperature sensitivity. It's currently about 1.3 meters of sea level equivalent per degree of warming. So we warm up the atmosphere a degree, we'll get about 1.3 meters of sea level rise. By the time the temperatures get up to 2 degrees above pre-industrial, we're going to be looking at a sensitivity that's doubled to about 2.4 meters per degree of warming. And when it gets to about 6 degrees, it's going to be about 10 meters of sea level rise per degree of warming. Now, there's every possibility that the world's average temperature could get more than 6 degrees above pre-industrial by 2100. And we're talking about 10 meters of warming, 10 meters of sea level rise per degree. And if you don't think that's a problem, take a look at a map of the world and see where the big cities are. Most of them are in tidewater. So it's a big deal. There was a report put out by Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada in 2019 that talked about the Canadian climate, pointed out that we're warming at twice the global average. You know, the global rate is an average. The poles are warming much faster than the tropics. We're warming on average across Canada at about twice the global rate. And this map, this graph comes out of that article, and it projects two futures, what I call the business as usual future, which is the trajectory on the red line here. 7.6 degrees warmer by 2100 than in 1985. The optimistic line is the really difficult one that says we're really going to get with it and we're going to keep the temperature of the globe on average to 1.5. Canada will be 1.9. So this is real and it's serious. This is changes in precipitation from the same document, and what it shows is the average change in precipitation with the same two lines. One of the points made in the document is there's lots of variation across Canada. We're going to be generally wetter, but it's going to be a bigger increase in wetness in the north and in the east and in the winter. And our winters are going to be wetter than they are now. And we can be confident of those kinds of changes. Now, what does that all mean for cottage country? As Terry mentioned, the Watershed Council put out a document in 2016. You can download it from our website, in which we looked at the mid-century. We didn't try looking far out into the distant future. We looked at the mid-century and we said, what are the conditions likely to be like in an average year in the middle of the century? And what will be those impacts? And should we be doing things to prepare? And this is one of the two slides which contains the main data that we pulled together in that document. Now, this shows temperature in Muskoka. What is shown here is two lines in blue for the present climate, two lines in red for the future climate, and each pair of lines represents the mean daily maximum temperature for every month of the year and the mean daily minimum temperature for every month of the year. And that's the present climate in blue and the future climate in red. And as you can see, it's going to be warmer, no surprise. It's almost symmetrical. And in fact, if you look at it long enough, you start thinking, well, that's not too bad. It's pretty much the same. And so I always like to highlight two temperatures, 0 and 30. 30 degrees is heat wave temperatures. And at the present time, we get heat waves of 3 or 4 or 5 days every year, in the typical year, where the temperatures are above 30. And that's with average temperatures in the mid-20s. So what we see is the future climate has averages around 30, which means that summer is going to be a hell of a lot hotter, to our way of thinking, than the summers we experience now. The 0 degrees is where ice and snow melt. And at the present climate, there are 3 months of the year where the mean daily maximum, the average daily maximum temperature for each month, there's 3 months of the year when that never gets above 0. That doesn't mean you don't get a thaw occasionally in January, but the average doesn't get above zero. And what we see is in that future climate, there's only January, which is just below zero. So many more freeze-thaw cycles, which has important impacts for the plants and animals, hugely important impacts for how we manage our roads, as all sorts of complications. This is a big deal. This is the second graph that I'll show you, which is simply the change in precipitation. Again, the future climate is red, the present climate is blue. And then the average year at the present time in January, you get about 64, 65 millimeters of precipitation if it's melted. In other words, if it's rain or if it's snow that's then melted to get the water, it comes out to about 64 millimeters in the average year. The future year, somewhat more. This one is not symmetrical. We have 4 months of the year, July through October, where basically there's no difference. The amount of precipitation is basically the same. But the rest of the year, the precipitation at mid-century is going to be more. If you add all those months together, you end up with about a 10% increase in precipitation in Muskoka. And I think Haliburton would be very similar, maybe slightly less than Muskoka. And the reason I say slightly less than Muskoka is because of the lake effects being more prominent here because we're closer to Huron and Georgian Bay. Incidentally, those summer, when the precipitation is the same as it is now, doesn't mean the summers will be similarly moist. In fact, they're going to be hotter. So there's going to be more evaporation. There's also going to be a lot more transpiration by the trees and the other plants. And so the net result is the summer and the fall are going to be quite a bit drier than they are now. So we're going to have excess water in the fall, winter, early spring, and a lack of water in the summer and fall. Effectively, the precipitation is being compressed into the colder months. Now, there are all sorts of consequences of that, but what we conclude in our document is that warmer and slightly wetter. In many ways, we're in a good part of the world. There are parts of the world where the climate mid-century is going to be quite terrible. We're in a good part of the world. But it's still going to be significant differences. And the precipitation occurring in the winter and that extra evaporation in the summer work together to cause a considerable increase in the likelihood of floods and the magnitude of floods. In fact, our data suggests that the average flooding will be about 3 times as big as it is at the present time. And 3 times as big is not something to not be concerned about. We didn't look at things like the frequency or severity of storms, but we know that when you heat up the climate scientists all agree on this, it's going to be fewer but more pronounced storms. So we're going to have rainfall delivered in large buckets instead of small buckets. And that has implications for how the environment handles it. So these are significant changes. This is not a trivial minor adjustment to the climate and we can just get along with life and forget about it. The lakes are going to be warmer. They're going to be more biologically active, which means the fish are going to grow faster. That's good. But there's also going to be a much greater risk of algal blooms. That's probably not good. We love our lakes and they're beautiful lakes. We don't want them to be scummy, full of potentially toxic algae. The low flow and the drought during the fall mean that we're going to be facing problems with wetlands drying up, with lake levels falling. We may be in a situation where the dream of having lake levels kept 2 inches below your dock because that's what you want, those kind of ideas will become simply impossible. Late summer, lake levels will be low. extreme spring floods. There's also going to be pronounced changes to our forests because the plants are literally going to discover they're living in a place that they're not suited to, and they need to move north to stay with the right kind of climate. They need to move north at about 10 kilometers a year, which is very fast for a tree. Most trees don't move that quickly. So this is going to be a challenge to our forests. We're going to see some degradation. There's going to be new tropical diseases for us, but also for plants and animals. New pests are going to come in, new impacts that we currently don't have. And there's also going to be much greater stress on our power supply and our data grids simply because of the storms being more severe. You know, tornadoes never used to occur in central Ontario, but they do now. We had one just near my house just a couple of months ago, and it took down 3 enormous trees. It was really sad to see. Anyway, so what do? When people are confronted with these sudden changes, like the floods of 2019, everybody rushes forward wanting to solve the problem. They want government to fix it, and it's very common that we come up with easy to understand but wrong solutions. And that's a problem around the world. I think it's actually useful to step back and try and get a new perspective. Now, I don't suppose you thought I was going to step quite this far back, but I think it's important every once in a while to reflect on the fact that we all share an absolutely beautiful, stunningly beautiful planet. It also happens to be the only habitable planet in our part of the universe. There is no planet B, and it's a finite planet. It can't grow as our needs grow. We've got to live within its capacity to support us. And I think we forget that. And we're pushing on the limits all the time. And that's the problem that we've created. So let me recap the problem. First of all, it's a problem we created. If we hadn't heated up the planet by putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the planet would still be bubbling along in a nice little Holocene way, and we'd all be living happily. We created the problem. Now, we understand the problem. We know why it's happening. We know what's happening. We're getting more and more information about how it's happening. But by and large, nearly all of us still have not yet appreciated its seriousness. Most people think climate change is happening. Most people think climate change is something that we'll get over, not a big deal. It's much more serious than that. The important thing to remember is because there are so many of us and because we're so clever, we have amassed power that no other creature has ever had. And in the course of amassing that power to do things that we wanted to do, we've misused it. And we've done things that we never intended. We certainly didn't intend to warm up the planet by dumping CO2 in the atmosphere, but we've done that. We've misused our power, and in doing so, we have literally shifted the world to new places or new states. And the solution that is obvious is we've got to use that power wisely. We've got to steer our planet towards safe places, places that are a little bit more like the Holocene, places where we can flourish. That's the environment we are adapted to. That's the environment that our civilization and our culture is adapted to. That's the environment we need. How the hell do we do that? It's not easy. But one thing to remember, first of all, climate change is not the only thing we're doing which is deleterious to the planet, but it is one of the big ones. And in each of these cases, we've caused damage inadvertently because we've had careless actions that have changed the planet. And what we've got to do is replace those careless actions with deliberate actions that will mitigate the problems or aid our ability to adapt to the problems that are coming. that sounds fairly simple. But in other words, we steer wisely. We've got to stop sort of just waving our hand on the tiller and driving the ship here, there, and everywhere. And we've got to start saying, no, we have to get from here to there. And we do this by steering in this direction. And we do that steering by carrying out these actions. That's the challenge that's in front of us. It's immense. I won't deny that. We're talking about repairing the climate of the planet. That's not trivial. It is a challenge that is going to require us to coordinate actions over the long term, like decades, and we're not very good at doing that either. We like to do things that are done in a year or before the next election. We're talking about doing something that our children will appreciate. So that's a challenge. Global coordination in order to solve global problems. You know, we have a whole bunch of countries on this world, and for the most part, we get along, but we're not real good at coordinating. But that's what we've got to do for this particular problem. And then all the little local problems, such as the flooding in central Ontario, they're all connected to each other and to this global problem. So you're not going to solve the local problems without dealing with the global problem. However, having said all that about the immense challenge, it is within our capacity to act. We know what we need to do. We don't need magic. We don't need technology that's not been invented yet. With the technology we have now, with the knowledge we have now, we can fix this. It's not impossible, but it is going to take real commitment. Governments are going to have to be involved because the task is simply way too big for individuals. And also because there's going to be significant pushback. There has been since the 60s, in fact, significant pushback from those people who are vested in the status quo and don't want us to change anything. If you don't believe that, just listen to what Jason Kenney has said in the last couple of days. Because steering a planet requires international collaboration and cooperation. So you've got to have governments involved, but you've also got to have individuals involved, because governments do what the people demand. And if we don't demand, they don't do. So we've got to have individuals involved, but the individuals have got to work on the government. Getting right back to Central Ontario, and I love this photograph because I love this time of year when the mist rises off the off the warm lakes as the air cools. It's absolutely magical. And this is a fantastic environment. We are so blessed to live here. If we want to keep it like this, there are some critical needs. And as well as reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, which goes without saying, we've got to do some local things. We've got to pay far more attention to the needs of the environment. We're really good at paying attention to the needs of people. I need this, or what's actually more truthful, I want this. We've got to start thinking about what does the environment need, and can the environment get what it needs while I still get what I want? We've got to think more about environmental needs. We've got to give greater protection for wetlands, shallow waters, and shorelines. These are the most critical parts of our ecosystem for the overall functioning of the ecosystem. And they're going to be stressed by climate change, there's no doubt about it. But they're also being stressed by us at the moment, and we've got to be much more protective of them than we are. We have regulations, they aren't strong enough. They need to be strengthened. We also need to develop a lot less tolerance for individuals who fail to comply with the regulations that exist. At the present time, we have perfectly good regulations governing how we use our environment, and for the most part, people abide by them, but you all know of neighbors who have done something that isn't quite right, And sometimes nobody discovers the fact and they get away with it. And sometimes the fact is discovered and they have a fine to pay, and they pay the fine as part of the cost of doing business. And everyone thinks that's fine. It isn't fine. We should be very intolerant of the behavior of people who do the wrong thing despite knowing better. And then finally, I think this is a central part of what we've got to do. We've got to start rethinking the relative importance of what I call property rights versus property responsibilities. I own a piece of land. Our legal system, our history, our culture, our religions, they've all taught us that if I own that piece of land, I have certain rights, and we guard those rights jealously. What about the responsibilities? What about looking after that land so that it can prosper and survive? That needs to be emphasized much more than it currently is, because sometimes rights and responsibilities are in conflict, and just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And we need to think more about that. We need to talk more about that, and we need to develop an attitude to the environment that is much more the attitude of someone who is a good steward rather than an owner and user. This is the absolute last slide, and I'm going to say very little about it except to point out that there is a type of land management called integrated watershed management. The Watershed Council is now advocating for the use of IWM as the only logical land management approach in the kind of environment we live in, which would apply to Haliburton as well. It's a big challenge for municipalities. It requires more collaboration with neighbors. But quite frankly, in an Anthropocene of rapid environmental change, it's the only approach with a good chance of working. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to hearing what's going to happen in the rest of the webinar.
So Peter, can you hear me? It's Terry.
Yes, Terry.
Okay, so there's been a number of questions that have been put to you on the chat line. So I'm just going to run through some of them if you know, for a few minutes. And one of the first ones by Sue McKenzie, she asked, why is Canada warming at twice the global rate?
Because the global rate is an average for the entire planet, and the way things are warming, the poles are warming fast and the tropics are warming less. So what's happening is we currently have a pretty big temperature difference between the poles and the tropics. We're going to progressively get a lesser and lesser difference in temperature between tropics and poles. And we're seeing this within Canada. I mean, the rate of change of the rate of increase of temperature in Nunavut compared to the Niagara Peninsula is quite dramatically different. If you want me to explain the physics, I can't without going to a textbook. But believe me,
okay. I think that's probably going to satisfy for current purposes. So Andrea Piercy asks that she puts in quotation mark, work on the global to solve the local problems. We have, you said that we have the knowledge, and she's asking who decides which knowledge we use and who gets to manage this global collaboration.
Isn't that an excellent question? We're in a world of alternate facts, and people are beginning to forget that there is a difference between the right answer and the answer I like. Who gets to decide? The scientists can put forward the facts of the case. The scientists can make the story about what is happening and what would happen if we were to do something slightly differently. Ultimately, it's the policy group that are going to decide what we do. And those people come at the facts from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives. They're thinking always in terms of how does this play relative to the other pressures on government, and so we have this interesting political thing that I'm very bad at, because I frankly think they should all shut up and listen to the scientists and just do what we tell them to do. But that's not the way the world works. And scientists need to learn how to be better at communicating the stories they are telling so that people actually understand them instead of just getting blown away by them. And that is a problem that we in the science community are well aware of, but it is ultimately, it's all of us together figuring out what we need to do, but obviously there have to be leaders and followers. I still cling to the belief that people are rational. I know they aren't all the time. I know I'm not rational all the time. I cling to the belief that we're capable of being rational and that there is such a thing as fact, and that we can look at the facts, and when the facts tell us to do certain things, we can be pretty sure that doing those things will get the required result.
Okay, so Eric put a comment in the chat section, Eric Lilius, to the effect that there's been a lot of government rollbacks in Ontario, even since the COVID pandemic has started. There's been, and now with looming deficits that are at the federal level in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and tens of billions more being added to the deficit in Ontario. Enforcing regulations has not been an easy job for any of the ministries charged with that responsibility, because they have less and less resources and people to do the job. And it's become, less and less effective in terms of their capacity to actually watch what's going on and police the rules of the game. So how would you think that we can mesh these two realities together? The need that's been demonstrated by the COVID pandemic, of the need for government to step up to the plate and to enforce the rules, as you put it, and yet the cutbacks that governments have been facing, government ministries, at the same time.
Okay, there's several things there, but I would remind you of what I said on the second last slide about rethinking the business of property rights and property responsibilities. Getting back to becoming stewards of land. If we start thinking of the natural world as important to us, critically important to us, and then recognizing that we have the job of managing, stewarding, whichever word you want, looking after the natural world, that will help a lot with the business of ensuring that people comply with regulations, because people will be more willing to comply with regulations that make sense. A world full of people who are so obsessed with their individual rights is a world where people are less likely to be responsive to governmental regulations. So that's why I said that. I think if we do not develop a much broader understanding of the fact that we are intimately related to the biosphere, that we cannot survive without it, and that if it changes, that can have bad consequences for us. If we don't appreciate the fact that we are a part of the biosphere, I'm not sure we can actually ever get this thing under control, because we are too selfish otherwise. There's lots of other societies which have done a better job than the current Western consumerist society, but we've done a very bad job. And incidentally, while I've been talking, I'm conscious of the fact you've all been breathing. Breathing is something we all do all the time. You breathe in and you breathe out and you live. If you stop breathing, you die. And when you breathe in, you take in air and you extract the oxygen from it. And then when you breathe out, you dump CO2. Now, how come there's still oxygen in the atmosphere? The only reason there's oxygen in the atmosphere is because the plants of the world spend their time dumping oxygen when they're doing their photosynthesis. Oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis, which they dump into the atmosphere. And if they didn't do that, we wouldn't have oxygen to breathe, and neither would any of the other animals. So understanding that the air we breathe supplies us with this vital gas, oxygen, that we cannot survive without, might help us to start thinking about taking care of the air. You know, and you can go on with those kind of stories, but it's a critical problem. When it comes to the cutbacks and those kind of things, COVID has been an amazing impact. I had no idea it was going to be nearly as severe as it is, and I've been generally impressed by the quality of the behavior of Canadian governments of all persuasions. Sure, I can find fault with some of the things they've done, but gee, I'm impressed at how well they've done, at how willing they have been to shove money in the directions where it's most needed, and reckon that the deficit can be dealt with in the future. That is something I would not have expected to the degree that it has happened, but it certainly has thrown a spanner in the works. And when it comes to doing something about the environment, yes, it's going to cost money. But one of the things we can do, and I need to be looking closely at how the throne speech pans out in legislation, is what are we going to do about getting ourselves climate change ready, moving ourselves towards a low carbon economy, and could we not make that an important part of building back after COVID? COVID has pushed us down. We don't have to build back the way we were. And I think there are some opportunities as well as some problems there. I'm sorry, that was a long answer.
Okay, there has been a couple of other comments, but I think that maybe, including one from Karen Coburn about the gross national happiness index as a replacement for gross domestic product. And I think that maybe we could save that to the end, because that's kind of fits into how we go forward in terms of whether or not there's how far we can go with local action versus how far we need to go forward with action at a larger level. So I'll hold that one until the end. And I think I want to thank you for your presentation and your answers. And hopefully what will happen toward the end is people will think of more things that they want to raise in a conversation, and we can have further dialogue after the other presentations are completed. So thank you very much. That was excellent, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight.
Not a problem.
So, our next speaker is going to be Sue McKenzie. Now, Sue is a retired elementary teacher with the Trillium and Lake District School Board and a longtime political activist. She's the co-founder of Climate Action Muskoka, along with Tamsin Tilson. She's the mother of 2 adult children, Alexander and McKenzie. She lives with her husband, Len, on a farm outside of Gravenhurst and has been there for 40 years. They're both avid gardeners and nearly, she says, vegetarians. They have had the privilege of extensive world travel both together and with their children, but now have committed to never travel by air again. Presumably that's for climate reasons. I had a privilege of talking to some people from the Climate Action Muskoka on a Planet Haliburton interview earlier this week. And this is an incredibly interesting organization. And really, we want to give thanks to Sue for taking the time to join us tonight. So Sue, I'm going to turn things over to you, and you can make your comments about what you guys have been conspiring to do in Muskoka on the ground.
Okay. You can hear me fine?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'd first of all like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you tonight from the territory of the Anishinaabe and the Huron-Wendat, and I acknowledge the more recent stewardship of the Mohawks of Wata and the Métis. So I'm going to give you a little background on where we came from, the kind of impetus for our organizing. Every morning I wake up worried about the lack of understanding of the urgent need to take action on climate. And as Greta says, once you see it, you can't unsee it. I can't unsee it. It's that feeling that led me to my need to take action. to not give up, to set up Climate Action Muskoka, which I'll refer to from here on in as CAM. Working with others always turns my mood positive, even before my first coffee's finished in the morning. So how do we get started? What was the impetus? It was a year ago today. There was no CAM. I asked Muskoka Power of Many if we could organize an event for the global climate strike. The sound system and the MC were arranged. Everything was planned. The speakers were set, an energy expert, a union rep, 10-year-old Daniel, and Huntsville High School students. The 4 federal candidates and the media had agreed to attend. Then I discovered that the town of Huntsville had already scheduled the steps of the town hall for an official flag raising at the same time as our world climate strike. What to do? Well, the day of the event arrived, 300 came, lots of children, families, grandparents, and featured right in the middle of our event, we all celebrated the Huntsville Culture Days flag raising together. We segued to them, they segued back to us, we shared our sound equipment with them, and they shared their square with us. That first event set the tone that Climate Action Muskoka has pursued ever since, a collaborative approach. I think fondly of that day now as the global culture strike. So after that event, many folks spoke to me over the next month saying, how can we keep this energy going? Subsequently, Tamsin Tilson and I met at the Bracebridge strikes. We called a meeting. Of the 21 people invited, 19 made it to that first meeting from all across Muskoka in the middle of a snowstorm in early November 2019 to discuss climate action. We recognized the wide and deep skill set that existed within that group. So the outcome of that first meeting was unanimous. We need to take action. It needs to be local. It needs to come from the grassroots, and we need to educate. So I acknowledge all the fine work and the scientific research that's already been done by environmental groups in the community. And it's wonderful to have the Muskoka Watershed Council and their report from 2016 that Peter Sale, I believe it was developed under Peter's excellent guidance. It seemed to us, though, that governments were still plodding along with business as usual, despite the science. An activist touch was needed as well to move things further and faster. We needed to be the grassroots leadership and to leave the comfort, basically, of our very comfortable lives here in Muskoka. So Climate Action Muskoka is an inclusive, nonpartisan group of citizens concerned about climate change in Muskoka, who believe in working together to inspire individuals, groups, and every level of government to make the dramatic changes needed to meet this historic climate challenge. So in the few short months that we've been active, I'll give you a list of a few of the things that we've been involved in. Today marks our 1-year anniversary of uninterrupted climate strikes, which we feel have kept the issue front and center in the community, judging by all the honks. Before COVID, all 3 towns had weekly strikes. Now 2 towns are holding strikes again. We have a strong social media presence and a website presence. Our weekly e-blasts, thanks to Tamsin once again, keep people informed of our actions and our issue and the other issues worldwide. I must give kudos also to Tamsin for her wonderful Muskoka Drawdown podcasts, and as well as the excellent Building Back Better columns in the paper, each one written separately by a different member of our committee. We've developed a resolution, and that's what I'm here to talk about further on in my presentation. We're currently seeking community-wide endorsements for that, and we'd like to acknowledge the recent addition of Peter's name to that list, as well as Environment Haliburton. So thank you so much for that. We've continued to liaison regularly with the district climate coordinator, so we're kind of trying to stay on the same path. And we've just gotten involved in a new project that Muskoka Steamships Discovery Center, our museum in Gravenhurst. We're partnering with them. We've given them extensive input to their new sustainability exhibits, which are to be hands-on and interactive. Their hope is that visitors will leave those exhibits determined to take action on the climate. The exhibit is to launch next spring. So, I've been asked just to talk a little bit about our climate emergency resolution. When developing it, initially, we spoke to James Gordon, a Guelph city councillor, about their municipal action. Then we researched other declarations worldwide, and there are so many. We met with the district climate mitigation coordinator and the district Muskoka Watershed Council liaison person to develop further items that should be in the resolution and to get some advice on wording. After all, none of us have ever written a resolution before, and none of us are lawyers. A lot of input and tweaking was done by lots of folks. Like housework, it's a job that seems never to be done. We see our resolution as a living document, and we hope to see the targets in it strengthened as we move into this important decade that Peter has demonstrated we are at the point where action must be taken. So what's in the resolution? Well, the resolution asks the District of Muskoka to declare a climate emergency, to develop a community climate action plan with clear goals to reduce GHG emissions by 50% by 2030 and to zero by 2050. To commit to becoming a drawdown regenerative community, taking an active role in repair and regeneration of all of our systems, the built environment, our natural infrastructure, land use, transportation, energy, waste, health, and food security. To support and participate in establishing a diverse community working group representative of the Muskoka community to provide input to the Climate Action Plan and to review and update it on a regular basis. To view every decision of district through a climate impact lens. To join with community stakeholders to educate the public. The big thing now is to get the resolution passed by District Council. We were originally scheduled to do that in March and April, and then, as we all know, COVID came along. So to that end of getting the resolution passed, we've had face-to-face, telephone, email contacts with politicians from all the different municipalities, assuring them that CAM is there as a community group to support them to take action, and that we are ready to collaborate with them. It is important that I mention here that the district is currently conducting a community-wide greenhouse gas inventory, in addition to its corporate greenhouse gas inventory. That the data that's collected from that will provide a baseline for a future community reduction plan. Yesterday, we presented the resolution to a district committee, and we gave them this message. There is irrefutable science that we're on track for catastrophic events due to warming. Municipalities will bear the economic, social, and environmental burden. Failure to address this emergency by reducing our carbon emissions will cost us much, much more. For every dollar spent now, $6 will be saved in the future, in future damage. That comes from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. We also gave them this additional message from Christiana Figueres, the architect of the Paris Accord. The time for doing what we can has passed. Each of us must now do what is necessary. The committee's response was positive. All councillors indicated they're supportive of the resolution. Councillors commented that everything's coming together and there's lots of support for passing the climate emergency resolution. However, there still seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the district timelines and those of the scientists and the community with respect to the urgency of the issue. So we continue to solicit community-wide endorsements of the resolution, hoping to strengthen our ask for bold action when we delegate to the full district council next month, and to demonstrate community support to those elected reps. So how do we see Muskoka reaching the targets we've asked for? There are two prongs to that answer. We feel it's district council's job to demonstrate leadership and to act on behalf of and with the community. The elected politicians need to find the answers to these two questions. How are we going to get there? And how are we going to give the people a voice? The other prong, and this fits quite well, I think, with what Peter was saying, governments can't do it all. So CAM itself is launching an exciting challenge that we're calling the Community Carbon Challenge 50% by 2030, to invite the community to assume the same emission reduction goals that we're asking of the District of Muskoka government. We hope to be launching that soon. So today, on this 1-year strike anniversary, we are unveiling the prototype of the logo we will use for our Community Carbon Challenge. You will be the first to see it. So back to that coffee every morning. When I'm finished, I say my daily Figueres mantra: impossible is not a fact, it is an attitude. And then I get on with my climate work. And I'll show the logo now. Oh, okay. So there it is. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that that helps with what you were asking me to talk about today.
Okay, Sue, thank you very much. There are some questions in the chat section, which I'll get to in just a second. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about is that as part of your process of getting this resolution before the district council, you had an endorsement campaign.
Yes.
And I'm curious about how that campaign came together, because on your website, there's dozens of organizations and individuals who have endorsed the resolution. I take it that was done in order to demonstrate community support to the politicians on council and so on. Could you talk a little bit about why you chose to do it and how you did it?
Okay, our organizing committee has approximately 30 people on it. So we really felt that it was important to reach out for each of those people to reach out to their contacts in the community. So a lot of that was done. A number of people did a lot more than others, as always goes on with organizations. We felt it was really important as part of our collaboration, rather than being an opposition to the government, that it was important for us to show how much support there actually is in the community. And having people come on and actually endorse on the website means that's a bigger commitment than just signing a petition. It's and having your name up there as well. So we're just trying to demonstrate to the politicians that community support is there, that we want them to take bold action. Is that all the questions you had? Did you ask?
Yeah, that gets at it. I think that I think that it's an interesting model for other communities to take a look at, because what that means is that you're essentially at the same time as you're putting a resolution, which from what I can see is one of the toughest across the country in terms of the targets that you're setting. At the same time as you're doing that, you're also building community support to basically provide a comfort zone, I take it, for the politicians who feel that they're not offside with large or significant sections of the community.
It also has, it allows a certain piece of education to happen as well, because when people come, they read the resolution, they get connected with Climate Action Muskoka, they maybe sign up for our e-blast. So hopefully it's part of our educational component as well, which we do take quite seriously in the community. And we've been kind of limited by COVID to doing a lot more educational programs, yeah.
Okay, I wouldn't mind getting into that in a little bit, but why don't, Andrea Piercy has asked a question with regard to your drawdown regenerative committee, and she wants a little bit more detail about that. She's wondering if that's connected to the drawdown global planning exercise that comes from the book and the website and so on and so forth. Could you just draw some kind of a relationship between, you know, that process and the drawdown regenerative community you're talking about?
Well, I really, yeah, it is, that concept came from the whole drawdown project, but it also comes from another one of our members who is involved with Builders for Climate Action, and they have they've done webinars actually and have done actual presentations in Muskoka, and I would recommend that Environment Haliburton get Chris Magwood to come and speak on that. But about the capacity of the building materials that we use to be used as actual carbon sinks. So in addition to the environmental aspects of being able to draw down, there's so many aspects to this whole thing. I mean, Peter was talking about how we have to start treating our environment and treating ourselves as basically stewards and as part of that environment, that we need to, we need to be regenerating our soils, our forests. As you know, you've done on your program, you've interviewed Norm Yang about the ash project and the fact that our forests in Muskoka, and I'm assuming in Haliburton as well, are suffering from osteoporosis. And that therefore they are unable to draw down as much carbon from the atmosphere. We really see as the drawdown project that we will eventually reach a point, we must eventually reach a point of drawdown, which is taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sequestering it again. And hopefully that will provide some stability to our planet.
Okay, I should just add right now for people, for all the participants, that there is a resource list that we're going to post on the Environment Haliburton website and send out to all the participants in tonight's webinar of anything that's been mentioned and a series of other related documents, including connections to Chris Magwood and the Endeavour Institute that he's part of and so on. There'll be a host of resources, including the study that Peter was mentioning, the Planning for Climate Change in Muskoka. All those kinds of documents and so on are going to be on that resource list if people want to take a deeper dive into some of those topics. So we'll put that on the website as early as we possibly can. Okay, any other, I see another one from Keith Hay. He is asking, and he's curious about whether or not the hospitals, or I take it, other organizations within the healthcare sector have endorsed your emergency resolution proposal.
I don't think any of them are on there now, but there's a retired doctor I know on the individuals list. We need to be clear that this is a work in progress, that we're still working on it, and it's been much harder to reach out to these organizations during COVID. We've had to do it by email, which means then you lose the personal approach, which we were able to do before COVID. So yeah, no, that's definitely an area that we want to pursue, because we know that the Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit has definitely spoken already on climate and the kinds of actions that need to take and how important it is that we take action on just for health reasons.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so I want to thank you for that presentation. I think that it's energizing to see the kind of on the ground work, and it's amazing that you've managed to continue those weekly strikes through all these months. And it's just incredible.
I should speak about that. When the lockdown came, we went to pop-up strikes at the end of our driveway all through the winter. We had, I was thinking about Peter's comment about how the winters are going to have freeze thaw, and we were out there in hailstorms and freezing rain and sunshine. It was so hot that it felt like the summer, and it was still like spring, so
okay. There's one final question that I might want to squeeze in here. It's Carolyn Coburn asked, when did you start asking for endorsements? I know there's a list on your website of all individuals and organizations, but when did you start that campaign?
I guess we started it in February. I think it was February. It's hard for me to remember that the time before.
Okay. So thank you again very much for your presentation. And I guess the next presenter is me. And I'm going to see if I can get that presentation. I've been having trouble with my computer. Eric, can you tell me whether or not, I got to share a screen, don't I? First. I'll see whether or not I can get this up on my screen. Share. Can you see that? Yes, thumbs up. Okay, I got to get this out of the way. Okay, so I'm going to take a few minutes and it won't be long, to talk a little bit about the climate change planning process and where it's at in Haliburton County. This process has been going on. Let me just see if I can get this to cooperate. Okay, so the climate change planning process started with the townships, the 4 townships in Haliburton County, essentially passing resolutions to give the county the authority to basically be the organizing body for an integrated climate change plan that cuts across the entire county and contains individual plans for each of the townships. And so the first phase of this planning process, which started in 2019, really got underway, was the corporate mitigation strategy. So this is focused on the internal operations of the 5 governments in Haliburton County: the county itself, Algonquin Highlands, Highlands East, Dysart, and Minden Hills. And so that's the phase 1 aspect of it. And we're still in phase 1, or just coming out of it. And phase 2 is the corporate adaptation part of this, where they're going to morph into, okay, how are we going to adapt? We know what we're going to do in terms of trying to lower our greenhouse gas emissions, but how are we going to try to adapt to the warming that's already in the system that Peter talked about, all that excess moisture, precipitation in the winter, for example, all that's going to be doing to our built infrastructure. And then the third phase will be a community-wide mitigation and adaptation project, which will start in 2021. So the county embraced the Canadian Federation of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Partners for Climate Protection 5 milestone projects. And these milestones are, as you start with creating a baseline inventory, greenhouse gas inventory, then you move on to set some emission reduction targets, you develop a local action plan, you implement that local action plan, and then you monitor the results of that process. And these 5 milestones apply to whatever phase you're actually in. So this is a complicated slide, but I just put it up there because I just wanted to point out a couple of things. They're not going to start the community mitigation, as I mentioned, until phase 3 in 2021. Of course, a lot of this has been delayed because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but there is no community engagement. Unlike what's been going on, as I understand it, in Muskoka, where there's been a considerable amount of public engagement that's been parallel to what CAM's been doing. And they hired a climate change mitigation coordinator who was very active in the community, doing popular education about the science of climate change, just how serious this situation is. None of that has really been done. That's been saved for the community stage, and the internal process inside the municipality has happened really without any community engagement. It's been really an internal exercise that's been run by the politicians and the staff of the various townships. So this is there's a corporate climate change plan that was actually presented to County Council on September the 23rd, and that contains a number of chapters. There's one for each of the 5 governments across the county, and this is what they have committed themselves to. And I don't want to cast any aspersions on anybody, but one of the things that begins to jump out when you take a look at a slide like this is that just cast your minds to the right-hand column here. These are the targets that were set by the individual townships. And one of them is this 12, 71, 15, 11, 15 for an average of 30. But that 71% is for the township of Dysart et al. And it includes a plan, and that's unfolding as we speak, of exporting a considerable amount of its landfill waste to Kitchener-Waterloo. I'm not sure what happened to my screen. What happened to my screen? Uh-oh. I'm not sure what happened. Oh, there it is. Sorry. Here we go. That's the slide I left off on. And the next slide I want to put up here is, if you adjust and you give the township of Dysart really the highest percentage from the county, a 15% reduction, if they had retained the landfill waste, the overall drop, the overall reduction target drops from 30% on a county basis to 13%. Okay, so I want to go back again. There's phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And I wanted to just end with a little bit of a comparison between Haliburton and Muskoka climate change processes. In terms of the plan content, as I understand it, the Haliburton is doing both municipal, corporate, and community plans, whereas Muskoka has so far committed to the municipal corporate side of things. And as part of that emergency resolution would if they adopt that, it would go beyond that to include a community-wide climate change planning process. On the community engagement side, Muskoka embraced official climate change education and community engagement really early on in the process, and have been instrumental, from what I can see, in helping to raise the profile of the urgency of the climate situation that we're in and the need for immediate action. And that the staff involved have been encouraged to become involved in leading that community engagement process. Haliburton has not engaged the community, as I mentioned, during the municipal corporate phase, but plans to do so during the community phase that begins in 2021. And the role of the county and township staff is not exactly clear at the moment, but they have not been available to do any community educational work up until this point. So again, the role, I want to just end by talking about the role of and raising some questions about the role of the Community Emergency Declaration Endorsement Campaign. So as Sue talked about, District Council is going to be asked to support a declaration and a climate action plan that's got very aggressive reduction targets built into them, 50% reduction by 2030 and a net zero by mid-century. And that's been supported by this endorsement campaign, which is seeking broad community support. Haliburton County was asked to endorse a declaration at the front end of the process earlier on this year, prior to any community engagement on an emergency declaration or the size of the cuts required, and they basically declined the invitation to do that. So one of the questions that I wanted to raise as a result of the comparison between what's been going on in Muskoka versus what's been going on in Haliburton is the centrality, it appears to me, of this endorsement campaign that Cam put out there, and the seeking and the active engagement of the community to come behind this resolution, so that the politicians on council get the sense that they're not out in left field, that in fact there's a tremendous amount of community support for stretching themselves quite a distance to embrace a very aggressive carbon reduction target. So that's all I've got. I just wanted to lay that out there and to hopefully stimulate some discussion about that once we get back into session. So I'm going to end my sharing and see if anybody has any questions for any of us about anything that's been said tonight. Put it in the chat box so we can have an organized way of being able to present this. Anybody have any questions or comments you want to make with respect to anything that you've heard so far tonight? Peter or Sue, do you want to add anything to anything that's been talked about so far?
I'd like to say something with respect to the endorsements. They don't just come in. We had to go out and actively seek them.
Right.
And there was a period where we weren't really getting any. So it's something you have to take on and you have to go after. And we're going to continue doing this, well, probably past the point of even having the climate emergency passed. So that was one of the things about the endorsements. The other thing is that when we speak with the climate mitigation coordinator, he is really, really happy to have us on board. And he feels that we speaking to the community will be listened to better than any level of government. And I don't know if he's right on that or not, but certainly if there are the two voices coming from the politicians and from the community, then hopefully we're going to actually get something to happen here, because it has to happen fast. It's really urgent.
So Peter, I'm just curious, maybe I could pose a question to you. You spoke about the fact that much of the action or much of the control lies with senior levels of government or outside of the community in terms of the kinds of problems. Individuals can't deal with it. It's a challenge for local communities. I'm just curious to get your take on how far do you think local climate change action plans can go to, let's say, taking a fair share, so to speak, of Canada's reduction targets. You know, that 50% reduction by 2030, net carbon zero by mid-century.
I think one of the things that concerned me when I first heard about the plan to have a climate emergency declared in Muskoka was the risk that it would become a fad, and that municipalities would declare a climate emergency and then tick that box as, well, we've done that, now let's get on and deal with something else. And I think it's to the credit of Sue and her team that they have tried to craft their documentation in a way where you don't just declare an emergency, you actually have a plan and you start doing it. Because once you have a plan and you start doing it, then your feet can be held to the fire. And then it becomes a useful thing for municipalities to do. The reason I think it's important to not lose sight of the importance of senior levels of government is many municipalities, and Muskoka and Haliburton are prime examples in Ontario, have a relatively small carbon footprint compared to the total carbon footprint of the community, because major industry, the power generation and all the rest of it, these things tend to be localized in certain places. We have the Bruce Power Plant complex sitting over there and on the Bruce Peninsula, or wherever the hell it isn't on the Bruce Peninsula, I know. But it's not in Muskoka and it's not in Haliburton, and yet it is providing a substantial amount of the power which Ontario's economy uses. And we can reduce our footprint in Muskoka and Haliburton to zero, and it won't barely scratch the surface of the footprint of Ontario. Now, if we could get Toronto to be doing things comparable to what Muskoka and Haliburton are trying to do, then you would see some real action. And I think so. There's certainly, it's important that these emergency declarations not be just greenwashing, but they actually are the front of something real. And it's important to also keep in mind that there's a limit to what can be done locally in places that don't have heavy industry. And we've got a lack of heavy industry. We've got a lack of transportation and all the rest of it. That's where the main load of energy is taking place. That's where the CO2 comes from. Now, if we could do something about Highway 400 and get it turned into a light rail and get all those cars out of there, or better still, turn them all into electric cars and have the electricity generated from non-fossil fuel sources, that would be tremendous. But you know, one of the biggest CO2 emitters that Muskoka causes is what happens on Highway 400 as people drive madly back and forth to Toronto. If we weren't there in Muskoka, they wouldn't be driving back and forth.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd just like to say something that I agree with Peter. I mean, the really big actions have to happen in the really big places, right? However, the only place that individuals can take action is locally. We can't really, I mean, we can support campaigns and write to our governments and so forth, but really the only place we can take action. And the reason we feel it's very important that the community not see themselves as old, I'm too small to have any kind of effect, is as people in the community begin to take on some of these issues and to find out more about them and find out that, hey, if I drive 20 kilometers less, 100 instead of 120 on our 400 and our Highway 11 over there, I'm going to save 20% on the gas. So that means 20% saving on the GHGs I'm putting in from my transportation. So we need to empower people to feel that they can do something in their own lives. And that's going to just add to the whole, well, I call it the 100th monkey syndrome. There was a book that came out many years ago that indicated that there's a critical mass of understanding of an issue, and then suddenly things start to shift. And so I do believe in that it's really important that we give the community that kind of empowerment, that even their little actions are going to have some effect. And so they don't just sit back and that's a form of climate denial is when you don't do anything because you're too small.
We don't have much time left, and I think we should start to wrap things up in a minute. But Keith Hay has written a little bit of a comment here with regard to seasonal residents, and I just maybe get curious about your take on this. Is how we engage seasonals in the discussion about reduction of greenhouse gas emissions when, in fact, they it's a pretty carbon intensive process getting here on the weekends and so on and so forth. Having been a 40-year seasonal tourist myself before I moved here permanently, I know what that's like. And so I just get you curious about how has the engagement gone with seasonal residents in Muskoka in your campaign, and has your campaign been endorsed by any of the lake associations, for example, that represent those seasonal tourists?
Yeah, we have quite a few lake associations on the list already, and the Muskoka Lakes Association, which as I understand it is an umbrella organization for a number of other smaller organizations, they have endorsed the resolution. One of our members is speaking to the Lake Bays Association next Tuesday, so we're hoping that an endorsement will come from there as well. It seems like that they are on side up to a certain extent, and Peter probably knows more about this because he is a lake dweller, as we are not. We are on a rural road on the Hawk Rock River, so we haven't been really involved with them. But yeah, they seem to be really interested. Now, as far as our campaign goes, we're hoping that our carbon challenge it's going to be put out to seasonal and year-round residents, and we're hoping to use the carbon tracker that the Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve has developed, which is one of the few that I've ever seen that actually is designed for this area. It's designed for Ontario, but and it actually has people figuring out what is their carbon footprint for driving their boat, their ATVs, their jet skis, all of those kinds of recreational vehicles. And I really think that those are the elephant in the room for many of us. And hopefully that carbon challenge will have them look at some of those things where they can cut down. Well, we all need to cut down on our recreational vehicle use, I think.
So Peter, I'm just curious about your take on this. I know you mentioned shoreline restoration and keeping care of our wetlands and our shorelines, and how crucial that's going to be for adaptation purposes and so on, but also to protect our lakes as the climate changes. What's your take on the possibilities around engaging seasonals in this?
I want to just say something that feeds into this, and that is, there was an article in one of the glossy magazines in the summer of 2019, which the Watershed Council never got around to rebuffing it, and we should have. It was, I forget which of the glossies, but we have several that get delivered to people's docks around Muskoka, and they're full of beautiful advertisements for everything to build your dream mansion. The article was an article about how wonderful grandfathering was, and weren't we fortunate that we had such strong grandfathering rules, because it meant that if you found a piece of land with an old fallen down cottage on it, you could get rid of that cottage and then use its footprint as something that's, while it no longer complies with the regulations, it used to comply a long time ago, and therefore we can build our mansion nice and close to the water, which completely defeats the purpose of the regulations to keep the buildings back from the water. And I thought the fact that that article was written indicated just how big a challenge there is to educate the broad community about the needs for dealing with the environment sensibly, because we should be ashamed of the fact that our grandfathering rules are so strong, and we should be seeking to weaken them. And if you tear down the old cottage, you have to build further back from the shore. The business of climate action and individual action, there's a lot of value in setting examples, and you have to be careful. If you try and ram the example down people's throats, it doesn't work, but you can get it so that it becomes the desirable thing to do. Yeah. I know people in Bracebridge who ride their bicycles in the almost 12 months of the year, and they're proud of the fact that they're not using the car. I've now moved into Bracebridge. I'm no longer living on the lake, Sue, much to my regret.
Oh.
But when I was living on the lake, I had a sailing kayak, and I used to sail my kayak all over that lake, never with a big sign on it saying I'm not using any gasoline, but just trying to get the message out to people that you can have a lot of fun on our lakes with vehicles that don't require gasoline engines. And I think it's a tragedy that there are so few sailboats in Muskoka. It's an ideal place for sailing, and there should be lots of little sailboats. And there are some, and Lake of Bays has a lot of them, but there should be more. And we shouldn't be wanting to have cigarette boats. But yeah, I'm digressing. The point is, until people see that there is fun to be had that doesn't involve using a lot of gasoline, we're going to keep using a lot of gasoline. And the more examples we can put out there, the better. And there's various groups that are trying to do it in different ways.
So sorry, go ahead, Sue.
Mary, I'd like to, I'll send you the link, but one of our members, Gordon Laxer, who is well known across Canada for his energy research and so forth from the University of Alberta. Gordon wrote a column for this, which was just published in the Star last week, and it's called A Carless Dream for Muskoka. And it's just his take on how we can bring the train back and the kinds of really employment opportunities that could be offered by making Muskoka an ecotourism destination. And well, I'll send you the link to add to your resource list.
Thank you for doing that. And I know that
so encouraging.
Right, and Gordon is also the author of I think it was a 2016 book called After the Sands.
Yeah, After the Sands. Yeah.
Economic and Environmental Security for Canadians, which is an excellent book about an energy transition, and we could put some of that up on the website as well. So I want to. Well, I guess there's one more thing I should do, because I promised I would do it, is come back to this. If anybody wants to make one final comment about this national, the idea that Carolyn Coburn was raising about replacing gross domestic product and our obsession with economic growth with a different kind of approach to the economy, the gross national happiness index, or something like that. Does anybody want to comment on that before we call it a night?
Well,
Peter.
I'll just make the comment that that's another part of changing our perspective on our place in the world. And I agree completely. It's something that should be promoted, but it's only part of it. We need to understand that we live on this funny little rock that's floating through space, and we should be taking care of it. And we're not there at the moment in the great majority of cases. So.
Okay.
Yeah, well, and I'd like to just add to that included in our support document that we have given to the district councillors, one of the ideas in there was that we moved to using, I think it's called a well-being index as opposed to gross national product. New Zealand, I think, has already adopted it, and Iceland, and there's a movement worldwide actually to have us be measuring that as our measurement of success rather than based on a money model. Yeah.
So I want to thank you then for your participation tonight once again. It was, I think, a very encouraging and very exciting number of things that you were getting us into, and I think that this is a good start to the kind of conversation we need to have in Haliburton County. So thank you for doing that. I'm going to throw things back to Susan, who's going to do a final wrap up. So back to you, Susan. Okay.
I just want to thank our presenters for a very energizing presentation. So we at Environment Haliburton have continued to work hard to bring interesting and important issues to your attention, even during the pandemic. And I can tell you that we have not paused for a moment. Before COVID, we had Enviro Cafes, at which we offered a small sum. We collected a small sum, rather, from our attendees to cover our costs of renting our venues and various other expenses. And now, although we don't have to pay to rent a venue, we have to pay for Zoom. And believe it or not, it costs about the same amount. So our income is mainly from membership fees and donations. So if you would like to help us continue to do the work that we do, we would be very grateful if you would be so kind as to renew your membership and possibly make a small donation so that we can continue to work on behalf of our environment. And you can do this on our website at www.environmenthaliburton.org. You just go to the membership and donations page and you'll find the information that you need there. I would like to thank my fellow members of Environment Haliburton, Terry Moore, Carolyn Coburn, Eric Williams, Katie Barashi, and Margaret Dobrensky, and also Bonnie and Greg Rowe of Concerned Citizens of Haliburton County for their work in organizing our events today, and especially Peter Sale and Sue McKenzie for their contributions to our presentation. And lastly, I'd like to thank you, our listeners, for joining us. And please watch for messages from me on MailChimp and in the papers and radio to find out what we're doing on October 13th. We've got some ideas, but we haven't quite fleshed them out yet. So please stay well, and thanks for your attention, and I wish you a good night.
Take care, everybody.